Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Tulley, President and Executive Writing Coach at Defend, Publish, and Lead, and welcome to episode 113, Four Actions After You Return from a Conference. I got the idea for this episode because the past 2 weeks for me have been pretty conference heavy. I've had one conference in Chicago live and another one that I normally am at live, but is in London and I'm doing remotely this year. So I've been thinking a lot about conference time and how we spend it and what it is we do with it to make sure that we carry back the information that we learned when we went there. Because I don't know about any of you, but sometimes after I get back from a conference, it takes me a couple of weeks to kind of get back into my regular routine of teaching and researching and doing my other things. But then I always worry that I lost something really valuable that I learned at the conference itself. And so over the past few years, and I actually put these practices in place right before the pandemic. So I think I maybe got to use them twice while conferences were still happening live and in person. So it's actually a good time to revive these practices now that I'm back face to face. But these practices that I put into place really seemed to help me make sure that I was using the content that I got at the conference, and I made sure that I kept the connections and things like that. So I just wanted to share these four with you because I just came across this list when I was starting to do this myself, and I thought this might be a good idea for an episode. So the first thing that I tend to do when I return from a conference, I'm fortunate that I do have some professional development funding. So of course I track down all of those receipts and make sure I'm going to get reimbursed for anything that I can get reimbursed for. So certainly that is probably number one that I always do. But a second thing that I do is I double check to find the latest version of the presentation or the handout or the paper that I actually did when I was there. Because a lot of us at the presentation itself or at the conference itself change, ideas on the fly. We might tweak a few things last minute. I've never been one to write the conference presentation on the plane, but if that's you, I just know for me, I have a very bad habit of saving the last version on my desktop just so it's accessible quickly, but it can't stay there. So I have to put it somewhere. And so the very first thing that I do after I kind of straighten out my receipt situation is find where the latest version is and save it somewhere permanently. So I know in a previous episode, I talked about making an archive. This is a perfect example of that where I actually am putting something like that into the archive. It is farther away. I don't need it right now. That's not to say I won't eventually turn it into an article or something like that. But for right now, I don't need that very latest version on the desktop unless I'm going to do something with it next. For example, if I'm going to start turning it into an article or something like that as one of my upcoming writing projects, I'll leave it there. I know in another episode, I talked about using fences to do some desktop organization. I can link to that one too. But I talked about in that episode how I used a desktop organizer called Fences, which just draws a little shaded brown bar around a couple of files on your desktop. And so I've just decided active writing projects that I'm working on go inside that fence. So for now, though, that conference presentation, at least the one that I just did, I'm not going to be using it immediately. It was kind of a very special niche project that I'm just not working with right now. If I am going to do something with it, I would, of course, leave it inside the fence with my active desktop projects and then go back to it. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which I think is way more important, is that at the conference, you probably have gained a bunch of new ideas. So you heard, different speakers talk. You might have gotten some of these ideas in conversation with other colleagues or people that you've seen. They might have come out of a discussion or out of a keynote. But for me, if it's a conference that has a physical paper program, a print program, I usually take my notes right in there in the print program, right on the pages around where the presentation is. And for me, that's a trigger. So I know if it was session, K45, I know right around K45, all my notes are there about that particular thing. So when I'm listening to a conference presentation, for example, and I'll give a concrete example of this. I was just at the Four Cs conference in Chicago. You can tell I have conference conference brain right now. I was at that conference just over this past week, and one of the things that I went to, one of the sessions I went to was about mobile writing and digital place and the idea of space. And it's a topic I was kind of interested in this presentation. I didn't have anything concrete to go with it. Like I wasn't going to this presentation to learn something about a project I was already working on, but I'm interested in the idea. So I don't know what I'm going to do with this. I don't know what kind of project I'm going to potentially make out of this or do anything, but I scribbled down a bunch of notes that I know I'm going to want for later. So one of the things that I do when I have ideas like that is I do have some project ideas that I wrote in there, just kind of notes to myself, like, how could I use this information into an article or a blog post or something like that? So the way for me to get those conference ideas into action is to put them somewhere. And so I know that I've also mentioned on another episode about how I've been using Asana more and more for writing project management. For me, what will happen with this conference idea, so I probably will call it something like mobile scholarly writing or something like that, but I will make it an idea. I will make it a new project, and it'll just be an idea in my Asana board. So I know in other episodes I've talked about writing project management. I've written an article for Inside Higher Ed on a writing project management chart that I use, and I will link to all of that in the show notes if you want to check it out. But for me, the idea is to get those notes out of that conference program and put them into my Asana board or on my writing project management chart. So that way I know that I had an idea at some point of something to do with this information to turn it into a scholarly publication or a collection or a book chapter. So in that case, that I know that one of the things that I did in the conference program is, as I was listening to this idea about mobile writing, I drew a little picture in that conference program. So I know that I actually have that in there as well. So another thing that I will do is use my phone and take a quick picture. So you can even do this with your notes if you don't want to like transfer any notes or anything, even just taking a quick picture with your phone and loading that picture somewhere. So for example, I could load that in my project management chart. I could load it or I could link to it in Google. But just having that somewhere that I can get it again in a way that I know where to look for it. Because right now I have no idea what I'm going to do with mobile writing. I might not do anything with that for 3 years, but someday I will come along I'll come along an idea that might fit in with that. And I'll say, oh yeah, I had all that stuff on mobile writing. So what I'm doing here is just making sure that I've put this project somewhere where I can get it. So like I said, it happens pretty much in 2 ways. It happens with my own presentation from a conference. So that was number 1 on this list of 4, is make sure that I'm putting those conference slides or the conference stuff that I presented in a place where I can get to it again and I know where it is. And then the second part would be, what about all those ideas I learned at the conference? So it's very possible that I have like 6 ideas that are in my conference program. What would happen with all 6 is each of them would become a new project in my Asana board. Or if I don't want to even be that detailed, I might even make one project call it something like 4C's conference ideas. I, though, like to make projects as the thing that they are. So I might call it mobile writing project or scholarly mobile writing or something like that, just so I know what it is when I'm able to go retrieve it. So that's the second thing. The third thing is I did make a couple of connections at a conference, which is one of the beautiful things about conferences. So, I did get a couple of business cards and a couple of people have emailed me. So the next thing that I do, and this is a quick thing, is I try to immediately follow those people on LinkedIn with a little note about, how great it was to connect with them. Same thing with Twitter. Those are the 2 platforms that I primarily use. So that's where I'm going to go and chat with some people. The other thing that I will do is I did talk to somebody about their research very extensively. So I'm not going to just talk to them probably on LinkedIn and Twitter. For that person, I am going to do an email this week and just say, hey, I really enjoyed our conversation. Here are some of those things that we were talking about because we were going to exchange resources. So that in that case, that would be a third thing. But that's another great thing about conferences. It is this point of connection, but unfortunately, I'm not going to remember maybe some of those connections in 4 weeks or in 6 weeks. And so I want to make sure that I connect with those people now. So, and sometimes I try to do it immediately at the conference if possible, like connect with somebody that night or on Twitter or LinkedIn, just so I remember to do that. So that's the third way, is doing those connections. And then the fourth thing, a lot of the conferences I attend, there's always some chit chat about next year and the call for papers to present for the next year. And so one of the things I do at that conference is just kind of do a mental check-in as to, am I going to do this conference again next year? Because the best time to decide if I'm doing it is when I'm actually at the previous year. So I know for one of the conferences that I normally go to, I always check out where the location is and I look at the time of year. Is that feasible for me to even pull that off? So in some cases, the one conference that I was just at, I know that I'm not going to be able to do, but the other conference that I'm presenting at virtually, Researcher to Reader in London, I know that one I will be able to do. So just the way that the time has worked out. So yeah, for me, really doing these 4 steps of saving the slides, making sure I have my ideas from the conference put somewhere permanently so I can go back and work on them, making sure I do the networking connections so I don't lose those connections. And then the fourth thing is just sort of making a decision about that conference for next year. But also, if I am going to do it, looking at the call for papers, deciding what's the deadline on that. And I also will drop the deadline in my calendar. So I usually drop it in like a week before it's due, just so I make sure that I don't miss the deadline. Certainly some of these calls for papers come at, I mean, usually we're all academics, we're busy, so everything's at a busy time of year, but especially so for some of these conferences where deadlines are in May at the very end of the semester. So that's another thing that I will try to do. If you have some other ideas about how you wrap up from a conference and just kind of make sure that you use the same, the information that you grabbed from the conference, from the program, the connections that you made, if you've got some other ways that you kind of capture that, definitely share them out on Twitter. And hopefully these are helpful suggestions. Happy writing this week.